The market square went silent the moment Priscilla Ashworth pointed her gloved finger and laughed. "Look at her," Priscilla said, loud enough for every stall owner and every customer to hear. "The beggar's girl, come to sell her rags." Her sister Camille joined in, covering her mouth with a lace fan, though her eyes shone with the same cruelty. Around them, a dozen villagers turned to look at the girl standing near the fabric cart, her basket of thread and buttons held tightly against her chest. Ilara did not answer. She had learned long ago that answering only made it worse. She kept her eyes on the ground and stepped around the crowd, her cheeks burning, her hands trembling around the basket handle. "Beggar's girl," someone else repeated, and then another voice picked it up, and soon it seemed like the whole market was chanting the words, though in truth, it was only a handful of onlookers, amused by the show the Ashworth sisters were putting on. Ilara's mother, Margaret, worked from dawn until the candles burned low, stitching dresses for families who could pay, and mending old coats for families who could not. They were poor, yes. They had little coin, and no land, and no name that mattered in the county. But they were not beggars. Ilara had never once asked anyone for charity in her life. Still, the words followed her like a shadow that refused to leave. She reached the edge of the square, and finally allowed herself to breathe. Her basket had tipped during her hurried walk, and half her thread spools rolled across the cobblestones, some falling into the gutter where rainwater from the night before still pooled. She knelt quickly, gathering what she could, ignoring the stares of passers-by, who slowed just enough to watch but not enough to help. "You dropped this." The voice was calm, low, and unfamiliar. Ilara looked up to see a man crouched beside her, holding out a spool of blue thread that had rolled the farthest. He was dressed plainly, in a brown coat with no crest, no ornament, nothing that marked him as anyone of importance. His boots were worn but well kept. His hands, she noticed, were not the hands of a laborer. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking the spool from him. He did not smile in the exaggerated way some men did when they wanted something from a woman. He simply nodded, as though helping her was the most natural thing in the world, nothing worth remarking on. "They should not have spoken to you that way," he said. Ilara stiffened. She was not used to strangers noticing her humiliation, let alone commenting on it. "It does not matter," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "People say what they like. Words cannot break a bone." "No," the man agreed, standing and offering his hand to help her rise. "But they can wound just the same." She hesitated before taking his hand. When she did, she felt calluses that surprised her, the hand of someone who worked, or who once had, though something about the way he carried himself suggested otherwise. His eyes were a deep, steady gray, and they held hers a moment longer than was proper for two strangers meeting in a marketplace. "I am called Ilara," she said, unsure why she offered her name at all. "Julian," he replied simply. No surname, no mention of family, trade, or home. Ilara noted this, but did not press. In her experience, people who wished to remain unknown usually had good reason, and she was not one to pry into another person's secrets when she guarded so many of her own. Chief among them the shame of being laughed at in front of half the village, day after day, year after year. "You are not from here," she said, studying him. "I would remember a face like yours." Something flickered behind his eyes, there and gone so quickly, she almost missed it. "I travel often," he said. "Business brings me through villages like this one, more than people realize." "Business," she repeated, glancing at his plain coat, his unremarkable boots, the absence of any merchant's ledger or traveling case. "What manner of business?" "The kind that requires patience," he said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close. "And observation." Ilara found herself wanting to ask more, but a call from across the square interrupted them. Her mother, waving anxiously, having heard the commotion, and hurried to find her daughter. "I should go," Ilara said, gathering the last of her spools into the basket. "Of course." Julian stepped back to give her room, but his eyes lingered, taking in details she did not expect a stranger to notice. The careful mending on the hem of her dress, the way she held her chin high despite everything, the quiet dignity that no amount of mockery seemed able to crack. "Perhaps we will meet again," he said. "Perhaps," Alara answered, though she doubted it. Strangers passed through the village all the time and rarely returned. She turned and walked toward her mother, leaving the man standing quietly at the edge of the square. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen him watching her long after she disappeared into the crowd, his expression unreadable, his mind turning over something far more complicated than a simple encounter with a seamstress's daughter. Margaret took her daughter's arm the moment she reached her. "I heard what those girls said," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I am sorry, my love. I am so sorry." "It is nothing, mother," Alara said, though her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "It is only talk." "Talk that follows us everywhere," Margaret said, her jaw tight. "I work my fingers raw so that we never have to ask anyone for anything. And still they call you that. It is not fair." "Fair has nothing to do with it," Alara said, echoing something her mother had told her many times before. "We do not need their approval. We only need enough thread to finish Mistress Colby's order by Friday." Margaret managed a small, tired smile at her daughter's practicality. They walked together toward home, a modest cottage on the edge of the village, where the fields began to stretch toward the distant hills that belonged, as far as anyone knew, to the great estate of Quorn. The Quorn estate was a place spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by everyone in the village. It was said to be grand beyond imagining, with gardens that bloomed even in winter, and halls so large a person could lose themselves within them. Few villagers had ever set foot past the gates. Fewer still had ever seen the Duke of Quorn himself, a man rumored to be young, serious, and almost entirely absent from society despite his rank. Alara had grown up hearing stories about him, how he had inherited the title far too young after his father's sudden passing, how he carried the weight of the estate and its people with a solemnity beyond his years, how he rarely attended balls or gatherings, preferring instead the company of ledgers and correspondents. Some said he was cold, others said he was simply tired of being fawned over by those who wanted his title more than his company. None of it mattered to Alara. The Duke of Quorn belonged to a world so far removed from hers that she rarely thought of him at all, except when her mother mentioned that the estate had once, years ago, commissioned a set of curtains from her grandmother's hands, back when the family had still held some small standing in the village. That evening, as Alara sat by the window mending a torn sleeve, she found her thoughts drifting back to the stranger in the market square, Julian. A simple name, offered without hesitation, yet somehow carrying more weight than it should have. She could not explain why his kindness affected her so deeply, except that kindness, real kindness, was rare enough in her life that she noticed it the moment it appeared. She told herself it meant nothing. A traveling man had helped her pick up dropped thread, nothing more. By morning she would likely forget his face entirely. But she did not forget. The next day, as she walked to the market with a fresh batch of mended garments to deliver, she found herself glancing at every stranger's face, searching, without quite admitting to herself what she was searching for. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself she had far more important matters to attend to, the rent that would come due soon, the fabric they needed for Mistress Colby's dress, the ever-present ache of hunger that came from stretching too little food across too many days. Still, when she reached the square, her eyes swept across the crowd before she could stop them. He was not there. She felt a small, foolish pang of disappointment and pushed it aside immediately, ashamed of herself for feeling anything at all about a stranger she had spoken to for perhaps 2 minutes. The Ashworth sisters, however, were very much present, holding court near the bakery with a group of admirers hanging on their every word. Alara kept her head down and moved quickly past them, delivering her mended garments to the tailor's shop without incident. It was only as she was leaving that she heard Priscilla's voice again, this time not directed at her, but at someone else entirely. "Did you hear? A stranger was asking about the village yesterday. Very well spoken, apparently, though dressed like a common traveler. No one could say where he came from." Alara froze for half a second before continuing on, telling herself it meant nothing. Strangers passed through often enough. It did not have to be him. But some quiet part of her, a part she did not fully understand, hoped that it was. What Alara could not have known, what no one in the village could have known, was that the man she had met in the square was not simply a traveler passing through on unremarkable business. He was Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Quorn, heir to one of the largest estates in the county, A man whose name alone could open every door in the region and close just as many. A man who had, for reasons even he did not fully understand, taken to walking the villages under his protection in plain clothes, unrecognized, simply to see how his people truly lived when they believed no lord was watching. He had done this for nearly a year now, ever since the weight of his title had begun to feel less like an honor and more like a mask he could never remove. At every ball, every gathering, every visit from neighboring families, he was met with the same practiced smiles, the same calculated laughter, the same daughters paraded before him like prize livestock at a fair. He had grown so weary of it that he sometimes wondered if anyone in his own social circle saw him as a person at all, rather than a title attached to land and income. The village visits had started as curiosity and become something closer to necessity. Here, unrecognized, he could watch how shopkeepers treated their customers, how mothers spoke to their children, how ordinary people carried their burdens without an audience to perform for. It grounded him in a way nothing else did. He had not expected to witness cruelty quite so plainly the day before. He had not expected to feel something shift in his chest at the sight of a young woman enduring public humiliation with more grace than most nobles could manage in private disappointment. Alara. The name had stayed with him through the night, turning over in his mind long after he had returned to the modest inn, where he stayed under a false name, whenever his village visits kept him away from the estate overnight. He found himself recalling small details, the careful mending on her dress, the steadiness in her voice even as her hands trembled, the quiet fire behind her eyes when she had asked him what manner of business brought him to the village. He had lied to her, in a manner of speaking. Not outright, but by omission, and the weight of that omission sat uneasily with him even as he told himself it was necessary. If she knew who he truly was, everything would change. She would treat him the way everyone treated him, with careful, calculated deference, searching for advantage in every word. He did not want that, not from her. His aide, a steady and discreet man named Edmund, had traveled with him to the village on the pretense of estate business, though in truth, Edmund had long since given up questioning his employer's unusual habits. "You were gone rather long yesterday, Your Grace," Edmund said carefully, as they sat together in the inn's private dining room that evening. "I was observing the market," Julian replied, not quite meeting his aide's eyes. "Observing," Edmund repeated, in the tone of a man who suspected there was more to the story, but knew better than to demand it outright. "There was an incident," Julian said after a moment. "Two young women, daughters of a local family I believe, mocking a seamstress's daughter in front of the entire square. Calling her names, humiliating her publicly for no reason beyond their own amusement." Edmund's expression sharpened slightly. "That would be the Ashworth family, Your Grace. Minor gentry, recently come into some money through trade. They have been angling for an introduction to the estate for some time now." "Have they?" Julian said flatly. "Indeed. Miss Priscilla Ashworth in particular has made her interest rather well known through several intermediaries." Julian said nothing, but something in his expression made Edmund choose his next words carefully. "And the seamstress's daughter, Your Grace? Did you learn her name?" "Alara," Julian said, and something in the way he said it made Edmund look at him more closely than he had in years. "A common name for a common girl, I would imagine," Edmund said carefully, testing the waters. "There was nothing common about her," Julian said, and the finality in his voice closed the subject entirely. That night, long after Edmund had retired and the inn had gone quiet, Julian sat by the window of his room, looking out over the darkened village rooftops toward the distant lights of the small cottage he had learned, through careful and discreet inquiry, belonged to a seamstress named Margaret and her daughter Alara. He told himself he was simply curious. He told himself it meant nothing, that he would return to the estate within the week and forget the entire encounter, just as he had forgotten countless other faces glimpsed during his village visits over the past year. But even as he told himself this, some quiet and stubborn part of him already knew it was not true. Somewhere in the village, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her, Alara mended another sleeve by candlelight, humming softly to herself, her thoughts drifting, against her better judgment, to a stranger with steady gray eyes and a name that gave away nothing at all. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment, how deeply their paths had already begun to entwine. nor how far the consequences of one small act of kindness in a crowded market square would eventually reach into ballrooms and drawing rooms, into the schemes of ambitious families, and into the very heart of the Quorn estate itself. For now, there was only the candlelight, the mended sleeve, and the quiet, unspoken hope neither of them was yet willing to name. 3 days passed before Julian returned to the market square, and in that time Alara had almost convinced herself that she had imagined the entire encounter, or at least exaggerated its importance in her own mind. Strangers came and went. Kindness, when it appeared at all, rarely lingered long enough to matter. She was proven wrong on a gray morning, when clouds hung low over the village, and a light drizzle kept most shoppers indoors. Alara had come to the square anyway, carrying a basket of mended linens for delivery, her shawl pulled tight against the damp chill. "You are out early," a familiar voice said, and she turned to find Julian standing near the baker's stall, his coat collar raised against the rain, looking entirely unbothered by the weather. "Someone must deliver the linens," she said, unable to keep a small note of surprise from her voice. "I did not expect to see you again." "I told you, I travel through often," he said, falling into step beside her as she continued toward the tailor's shop. "Business, as I mentioned." "Business that keeps bringing you back to the same small village," Alara said, arching an eyebrow. "You must have very particular business indeed." Something flickered across his face, amusement mixed with something more guarded. "Perhaps I simply find the company here worth the return trip." Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks and quickly looked away, focusing instead on avoiding a puddle that had gathered near the cobblestones. "You should be careful with words like that," she said. "People might think you mean something by them."
"And if I did?"
She had no answer for that, and so she said nothing at all, walking in silence beside him until they reached the tailor's shop. He did not follow her inside, but waited outside beneath the awning, and when she emerged a few minutes later, he was still there, seemingly content to wait despite the rain. "You did not have to wait," she said. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "Will you walk with me a while? There is a bakery near the square that sells something called honey bread. I am told it is quite good, though I confess I have not yet tried it." Alara hesitated. Every instinct honed by years of public mockery told her to decline, to protect herself from whatever attention this might bring, whatever rumors might follow. But something in his steady gray eyes, something patient and unhurried, made her want to accept, despite her better judgment. "A short walk," she said. "I have chores waiting at home." They walked together through the damp streets, and Julian bought 2 pieces of honey bread from the small bakery, handing one to Alara with a seriousness that suggested he considered the transaction far more important than it appeared. "Well?" he asked, as she took her first bite. "It is good," she admitted, surprised by the warmth spreading through her chest, though whether from the bread or the company she could not quite say. They found a covered bench near the edge of the square, sheltered from the worst of the rain, and sat together in comfortable silence for a moment before Julian spoke again. "May I ask you something?" he said. "You may ask. I cannot promise an answer. Those 2 young women who mocked you the other day, does that happen often?" Ilara's shoulders tensed slightly, but she did not look away. "Often enough," she said. "It has happened since I was a child. My mother and I have little money, and little standing in the village, and some people find that reason enough for cruelty." "That is no reason at all," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. "No," Alara agreed, "but reason has little to do with cruelty. People mock what makes them feel superior, and poverty is an easy target." "Does it not anger you?" Alara considered the question carefully before answering. "It used to," she said. "When I was younger, I would cry for hours after every unkind word. My mother taught me that tears only fed their satisfaction, so I learned to hide it instead. Now I simply endure it and remind myself that their opinion of me changes nothing about who I actually am." "That takes a great deal of strength," Julian said, and there was something in his tone, an admiration he did not attempt to hide, that made Alara's chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. "It takes practice," she said, deflecting the compliment, though she could not quite manage a smile. "Enough about me. What of you? You have asked many questions but answered very few of your own. What is your business, truly? You do not dress as a merchant. nor speak as one. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Alara wondered if she had finally pushed too far. If he would simply rise and excuse himself, as strangers sometimes did when questioned too closely. "I manage affairs for a large estate," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. "My work requires me to travel through many villages, observing how things truly are, rather than how they are reported to be." "That sounds like a lonely sort of work," Alara said. "It can be," Julian admitted, "though less lonely on days like today." Alara felt her cheeks warm again and busied herself with the last bite of honey bread to avoid meeting his eyes. When she finally looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, somewhere between curiosity and something deeper, something that made her stomach flutter in a way she did not entirely trust. "I should return home," she said, rising from the bench. "My mother will worry." "Of course," Julian said, standing as well. "May I walk you part way?" She agreed, and they walked together through the quieting streets until they neared the edge of the village where the cottage came into view. Alara stopped a short distance away, unwilling to let him see exactly where she lived, some instinct telling her to guard that small piece of privacy, even as she had shared so much else with him. "Thank you for the bread," she said, "and for the company." "Thank you for allowing it," Julian replied. "Perhaps I will see you again soon." "Perhaps," she said, echoing her earlier words, though this time, the possibility did not feel quite so distant. She watched him walk away until he disappeared around a bend in the road, and only then did she allow herself a small, private smile, one she quickly schooled into neutrality as she continued toward home, aware that her mother would notice even the smallest change in her expression. Margaret, as expected, noticed immediately. "You look happy," she said, studying her daughter's face as Alara set the empty basket by the door. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," Alara said, though the smile she had tried to suppress crept back despite her best efforts. "Alara Winters, do not lie to your mother," Margaret said, though her tone held more curiosity than reproach. "You have not looked this way in a very long time." Alara sighed, knowing there was little point in hiding things from her mother, who had always possessed an almost uncanny ability to read her daughter's moods. "There is a man," she admitted, "a traveler, passing through on business for some estate. We have spoken twice now." Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. "And what is he like, this traveler?" "Kind," Alara said, after a moment of consideration. "Thoughtful. He listens more than he speaks, and when he does speak, his words carry weight. He does not treat me as though my poverty makes me less worthy of conversation." "That is rare enough in men of any station," Margaret said. "What is his name?" "Julian," Alara said. "He gave no surname, and I did not press him for one." "A man without a surname," Margaret mused. "Curious. Be careful, my love. Kindness can be genuine, but it can also be a mask worn by men who want something they have not yet named." "I know, Mother," Alara said, though privately, she did not believe Julian's kindness was any kind of mask. There had been something too unguarded in his eyes, something too careful in the way he asked about her hardships without ever making her feel pitied for them. Over the following weeks, Julian's visits to the village became more frequent, though never so frequent as to draw undue attention. He and Alara would meet, seemingly by chance, near the market square or the small bakery, and their conversations grew longer and more comfortable with each encounter. He learned of her father, who had died when she was young, leaving Margaret to raise Alara alone through years of careful, exhausting work. She learned, in turn, small fragments of his own life. A father who had died, leaving heavy responsibilities behind. A childhood spent more among ledgers and expectations than among friends. Neither spoke directly of love, though it grew between them regardless, quiet and patient, built from honest conversation, rather than grand gestures or empty flattery. Alara found herself, for the first time in years, looking forward to something beyond mere survival. She caught herself humming while she worked, smiling at small things that would once have seemed unremarkable, imagining, against her own better judgment, a future that included more than mended linens and market square mockery. She did not yet know the truth of who Julian really was. She did not know that every evening, after their conversations ended and she returned to her modest cottage, He traveled not to some distant inn on business, but back toward the grand gates of the Quorn estate, where servants bowed and addressed him as Your Grace, where a mountain of correspondence and obligation waited to reclaim him from the brief freedom he found in her company. She did not know that the closer he grew to her, the more urgently he needed to decide how, and when, to reveal the truth, and how deeply that revelation might change, or shatter, everything they had quietly built between them. For now, there was only honey bread shared beneath a covered bench, quiet conversation exchanged like careful gifts, and the slow, unmistakable warmth of something neither of them was yet ready to name, growing steadily beneath the surface of two lives that seemed, on paper, to belong to entirely different worlds. At the Quorn estate, far removed from the quiet lanes and modest cottages of the village, Julian sat behind a heavy oak desk, buried beneath letters, ledgers, and requests from tenants and merchants alike. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Constance, watched him from the doorway of his study, her sharp eyes taking in the distracted way he stared at the papers before him, without truly reading them. "You have been distant lately," she said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation, as was her custom. "Distracted. Edmund tells me you have taken to disappearing for hours at a time, and returning with no clear account of where you have been." "The state business requires travel, Mother," Julian said, though he did not meet her eyes. "Estate business," Constance repeated, settling into the chair across from his desk with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades navigating the politics of noble society. "Julian, I have known you since the day you were born. I know when you are being evasive." Julian set down his pen and finally looked at his mother directly. She was a formidable woman, respected and slightly feared throughout the county, but she had also always been honest with him in a way few others dared to be. "There is a young woman," he admitted finally, "in one of the villages near the eastern boundary. I have been visiting her, under a false name, without revealing my title." Constance's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, concern, and finally something more thoughtful. "And why have you not told her the truth?" "Because the moment she learns who I am, everything changes," Julian said, frustration evident in his voice. "Every conversation we have shared, every moment of honesty, becomes suspect. She will wonder if I sought her out for some calculated reason, whether my interest is genuine, or merely the amusement of a bored nobleman. I could not bear that." "And yet," Constance said carefully, "the longer you wait to tell her, the more painful that revelation will eventually be. Deception, even well-intentioned deception, has a way of curdling into betrayal when it is finally uncovered." Julian said nothing, because he knew, deep down, that his mother was right. He had told himself countless times that he would explain everything soon, that he simply needed a little more time to be certain of his own feelings before risking the fragile trust he and Alara had built. But each visit only deepened his attachment, and with it, the fear of losing her entirely once the truth emerged. "Who is her family?" Constance asked. "Is she of any standing?" "Her name is Alara Winters," Julian said. "Her mother is a seamstress. They have little money and no title, but she carries herself with more grace and honesty than half the noblewomen who have paraded themselves before me at every ball this county has hosted." Constance was quiet for a long moment, studying her son's face with an expression that mixed caution with something almost hopeful. "You care for her a great deal," she said finally. It was not a question. "I do," Julian admitted, the words feeling strange and vulnerable in his mouth, unused to voicing such things aloud. "More than I expected to, and more quickly than I thought possible." "Then you must decide what you intend to do about it," Constance said, rising from her chair. "But know this, Julian, if your intentions are genuine, the county will not make this easy for you. There are families who have spent years positioning their daughters for your attention, and they will not welcome a seamstress's daughter into the fold without resistance." "I am aware," Julian said grimly, thinking immediately of Priscilla Ashworth and her calculated cruelty toward Alara in the market square, a memory that still made his jaw tighten with anger whenever he recalled it. "Then be careful," Constance said, pausing at the door. "Both for her sake and your own. Whatever you decide, decide it soon. Secrets like this rarely stay buried as long as we hope." After she left, Julian sat alone in his study for a long while, staring at the papers before him, without truly seeing them. His mind consumed instead by the growing tangle of his own making. He had begun this deception with good intentions, wanting simply to know Alara as a person rather than as a prize to be won or a name to be flattered. But good intentions, he was beginning to realize, did not erase the weight of dishonesty, however gently it had been carried. He thought of her laugh, quiet and genuine, so different from the practiced titters of noble women, performing amusement for his benefit. He thought of the steady way she met his eyes even during their most difficult conversations, never flinching from honesty, even when it cost her something. He thought of the small, private smile she had given him after their shared honey bread, a smile that had settled something restless in his chest that had been unsettled for years. He could not lose that. Whatever the cost, whatever complications arose from revealing his true identity, he could not bear to lose the honest connection they had built. He resolved, sitting alone in his study as evening light faded outside his window, that he would tell her soon. Not through some careless slip or accidental discovery, but through his own deliberate choice, on his own terms, in a way that honored the trust she had placed in him. He did not yet know how difficult that resolution would be to keep, nor how quickly circumstances beyond his control would force the truth into the open before he was ready. Meanwhile, in the village, Alara's life had begun to feel different in small but meaningful ways. Mistress Colby, pleased with the quality of Alara's mending work, had recommended her services to several other families in the area, bringing in slightly more income than the household had seen in years. It was not wealth by any measure, but it was enough to ease some of the constant worry that had shadowed their days. "You seem lighter these days," Margaret observed one evening, as they sat together mending garments by candlelight. "Both in spirit and in your work. Mistress Colby says you have taken on quite a reputation for careful stitching." "I am simply trying harder," Alara said, though she knew the truth ran deeper than mere effort. Something had shifted within her since meeting Julian, some quiet hope that had begun to soften the sharp edges of her daily struggles. "It is more than that," Margaret said gently. "You are happy, Alara. I have not seen you this way in years." Alara did not deny it, though she remained cautious about voicing her feelings too openly. Even to her own mother, she had learned, through years of disappointment, not to trust happiness too quickly, lest it be snatched away without warning. Still, she could not deny the way her heart lifted whenever she thought of Julian, nor the way she found herself anticipating their next meeting, with an eagerness she had not felt about anything in a very long time. Their meetings continued through the following weeks, growing steadily more frequent and more comfortable. They walked together along the quieter paths at the edge of the village, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their small daily frustrations. Julian learned of Alara's dream to one day open a proper shop of her own, rather than working piecemeal for whichever family required mending that particular week. Alara learned of Julian's quiet love for old maps and forgotten histories, a passion he rarely had opportunity to indulge, given the constant demands of his supposed estate work. Neither spoke directly of the growing feelings between them, though both were increasingly aware of the warmth that colored every conversation, every shared silence. Every lingering glance held a beat too long before one of them looked away. It was during one such walk, along a quiet path bordered by wildflowers just beginning to bloom, that Julian finally worked up the courage to broach a subject he had avoided for weeks. "Alara," he said, stopping beside a small wooden bridge that crossed a narrow stream. "There is something I must tell you, something about myself I have not been entirely honest about." Alara's stomach tightened at his serious tone, a familiar fear rising within her, the fear that had haunted every good thing in her life. The fear that happiness, once found, would inevitably be taken away. "What is it?" she asked quietly, bracing herself for whatever confession he intended to make. Julian opened his mouth to speak, the words he had rehearsed countless times, finally ready to leave his lips. But before he could utter a single word, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them, and a small group of riders emerged from the tree line, led by a man Alara recognized immediately from occasional glimpses at village gatherings. Edmund, the steward of the Quorn estate, accompanied by two others in fine livery. Edmund's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Julian, standing casually beside a village girl, dressed in plain clothes, clearly unrecognized. He quickly composed himself, but not before Alara noticed the brief flicker of surprise, and something like recognition, cross his features. Forgive the interruption, Edmund said carefully, his eyes flicking between Julian and Alara with obvious meaning. There is an urgent matter requiring your attention. It cannot wait. Julian's jaw tightened, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders, though he kept his voice carefully neutral. I will attend to it shortly, he said. Now, if you please, Edmund said, his tone leaving little room for argument, though he softened it with a respectful nod that seemed strangely formal for a simple traveling steward addressing a fellow servant of the estate. Alara watched the exchange with growing confusion, sensing an undercurrent she did not fully understand, a formality, in Edmund's manner, that seemed oddly misplaced for the circumstances Julian had described of his work. I am sorry, Julian said, turning back to her, his expression torn between frustration and something like dread. I must go. But what I wish to tell you remains important, and I promise I will return to finish this conversation soon. Of course, Alara said, though unease had already begun creeping into her chest, an instinct she could not quite name, warning her that something significant had just been left unsaid, something that would change everything once finally spoken aloud. She watched him mount one of the horses Edmund's men had brought, watched him ride away toward the distant hills where the Quorn estate stood hidden behind its grand gates, and found herself wondering, with a growing sense of unease, exactly what truth he had been so close to revealing, and why the steward's sudden appearance had seemed to carry the weight of something far more urgent than simple estate business. The urgent matter, as it turned out, was a dispute among the estate's tenant farmers over water rights to a stream that ran through several of their properties, a disagreement that had escalated into raised voices and threats of violence between two families who had once been close friends. Julian spent the better part of 2 days mediating the conflict, his mind only half present as the other half remained fixed on the unfinished conversation with Alara, the confession he had come so close to making before duty had pulled him away. By the time the dispute was resolved and tempers had cooled, Julian found himself more determined than ever to finish what he had started. He could not continue deceiving Alara, not when their connection had grown into something he valued more than almost anything else in his carefully ordered life. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Word of Julian's frequent, unexplained absences had begun to spread through certain circles of local gentry, circles that included the Ashworth family, whose interest in securing an introduction to the Duke had only intensified in recent months. Priscilla Ashworth, ever alert to opportunities that might advance her family's social standing, had grown increasingly frustrated by Julian's continued absence from social gatherings and had begun making discreet inquiries into where, exactly, the Duke spent his time when he was not attending to visible estate business. It was through one such inquiry, made to a servant who owed the Ashworth family a favor, that Priscilla learned of a pattern. The Duke's steward, Edmund, had been seen on several occasions traveling toward the eastern village, the very village where the seamstress and her daughter lived, the very village where Priscilla herself had publicly humiliated a poor girl only weeks before. The pieces did not immediately fall into place for Priscilla, but suspicion, once planted, has a way of growing roots that spread further than initially intended. Camille, Priscilla said to her sister one evening, as they sat together in their family's modest but well-appointed drawing room, have you heard any rumors about a traveler visiting the eastern village? A man of unusual bearing, though dressed plainly. Camille frowned, setting down her needlework. I believe someone mentioned something of the sort. A stranger who has been seen speaking with that seamstress girl, the one we encountered in the market some weeks ago. Why do you ask? No particular reason, Priscilla said, though her mind was already working through possibilities she found increasingly difficult to dismiss. Merely curious. She did not yet suspect the full truth, not with any certainty, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and Priscilla Ashworth was not a woman inclined to let curiosity remain unsatisfied for long. Meanwhile, in the village, Alara continued her days much as before, though the unfinished conversation with Julian weighed on her thoughts more heavily than she cared to admit. She found herself replaying the moment repeatedly in her mind, wondering what confession he had been so close to making, and why the arrival of his steward had carried such an air of formality and urgency. Nearly a week passed before Julian returned to the village, and when he did, Alara noticed immediately that something about him had changed. He seemed more determined, more focused, though also carrying a weight of nervousness she had not seen in him before. They met near their usual bench, close to the market square, and Julian wasted little time before speaking. "Elara," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible tension in his posture. "I must finish what I began to tell you before we were interrupted." Elara's heart quickened, though she kept her expression carefully composed, years of practice, allowing her to mask her emotions, even when they threatened to overwhelm her. "I am listening," she said simply. "The work I do," Julian began, choosing his words with obvious care, "is not merely managing correspondence and ledgers for a distant estate owner, as I have allowed you to believe. My connection to the Quorn estate runs far deeper than that." Elara's stomach tightened, a dozen possibilities racing through her mind, none of them entirely pleasant. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Before Julian could answer, a commotion near the edge of the square drew both their attention. A group of finely dressed riders had arrived, drawing curious stares from villagers, who rarely saw such visitors in their humble market. At the front of the group rode a woman Elara recognized immediately, not from personal acquaintance, but from the occasional glimpses caught during rare estate processions through the village years before. The Dowager Duchess Constance. Elara had never seen the Duchess this close before, but there was no mistaking the regal bearing, the fine clothing, the aura of authority that surrounded her like an invisible cloak. And beside the Duchess, looking distinctly uncomfortable at having his private world suddenly collide with his public one, stood Edmund, the steward Elara had met briefly on the wooden bridge weeks before. The Duchess's eyes swept across the square before landing on Julian, and something in her expression shifted from searching to satisfied recognition. "Julian," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square, a voice accustomed to command, unaccustomed to being ignored. "I had hoped to find you here." A ripple of confusion and whispered speculation spread through the gathered villagers at the sound of that name, spoken with such familiar authority, by a woman clearly of noble standing. Elara felt her stomach drop, as the pieces she had been trying to avoid assembling finally clicked into place with sickening clarity. "Your Grace," a nearby villager whispered, loud enough for Elara to hear, addressing not the Duchess, but staring directly at Julian, with dawning recognition. Elara turned to Julian, her eyes searching his face for some explanation, some denial of what she had just begun to understand. But the guilt and resignation written plainly across his features told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke a single word. "Elara," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "I intended to tell you myself, in my own time, in my own way. I never wished for you to learn the truth like this." "The truth," Elara repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, the market square around them fading into meaningless noise as her mind struggled to process what was happening. "And what truth is that exactly?" "I am Julian Ashcombe," he said, the words falling heavily between them. "Duke of Quorn." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Elara could not move, could not speak, could not fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had just heard. Every conversation they had shared, every small confession, every moment of vulnerability she had offered him, believing him to be nothing more than a traveling steward with no particular standing, suddenly took on an entirely different weight. "You lied to me," she said finally, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger she could barely contain. "All this time, every conversation, every walk, every word you spoke to me, and you lied." "I did not lie about my feelings," Julian said urgently, stepping toward her, though she instinctively stepped back, putting distance between them that felt suddenly necessary, even as it pained her to do so. "Everything I told you about myself, everything I felt in your presence, was true. I only withheld my title, and I did so because I wanted you to know me as a person, not as a position." "You wanted to observe me," Elara said, the realization striking her with fresh pain. Like some curious specimen, the beggar's girl, entertaining herself with a stranger who turned out to be a duke playing at being ordinary. "Was that amusing for you? Did you enjoy watching a poor seamstress's daughter fall for a lie?" "It was never a game," Julian said, his voice raw with emotion, aware of the growing crowd of onlookers gathering to witness this unexpected confrontation, aware of Priscilla Ashworth standing at the edge of the square, with an expression of stunned, calculating recognition, slowly dawning across her features. "Alara, please. Let me explain properly, away from all these eyes." But Alara had already begun backing away, her chest tight with a betrayal that felt more devastating than any public mockery she had ever endured. All the mockery from the Ashworth sisters, all the whispered insults she had learned to endure over years of poverty and public shame, none of it had prepared her for this particular kind of pain. The pain of discovering that even the one genuine connection she had allowed herself to trust had been built, however unintentionally, on a foundation of deception. "Do not follow me," she said quietly, before turning and walking quickly away from the square, ignoring Julian's voice calling after her, ignoring the stunned whispers rippling through the crowd of villagers who had just witnessed the poor seamstress's daughter reveal an unexpected connection to the Duke of Quorn himself. She did not stop walking until she reached the safety of her own small cottage, where she collapsed against the closed door, tears finally spilling free after weeks of carefully guarded composure, her heart shattered by a truth she had never seen coming, from the one person she had allowed herself to trust completely. Behind her, in the market square, chaos of a different kind had begun to unfold, as villagers scrambled to process what they had just witnessed, as the Dowager Duchess Constance dismounted with visible concern etched across her aristocratic features, and as Priscilla Ashworth watched the entire scene with narrowed eyes, already calculating how this unexpected revelation might be turned to her own advantage. Julian stood frozen in the middle of the square, long after Alara had disappeared from view, the murmur of the gathered crowd washing over him like distant noise he could barely register. His mother approached slowly, her expression carefully neutral, though concern flickered clearly behind her composed exterior. "That did not go as I imagine you had hoped," Constance said quietly, coming to stand beside her son. "I was going to tell her," Julian said, his voice tight with frustration, directed as much at himself as at the circumstances. "I had already begun explaining when you arrived. I only needed a few more minutes." "There is rarely a convenient moment for difficult truths," Constance said gently. "I am sorry my arrival interrupted things so poorly. I came because Edmund informed me of your continued absences, and I confess, I grew curious enough to see for myself the young woman who has captured my son's attention so thoroughly." Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Constance had rarely witnessed from her typically composed son. "She believes I deceived her purely for entertainment," he said, "that I viewed her as some curiosity to observe, rather than as someone I have come to care for deeply." "Then you must convince her otherwise," Constance said simply. "Words alone may not suffice after such a shock, Julian. She will need time, and likely more than words, to trust that your feelings were genuine." Nearby, close enough to overhear fragments of this conversation despite her attempts to appear disinterested, Priscilla Ashworth stood with her sister Camille, both women processing the unexpected revelation with very different reactions. Camille appeared genuinely startled, uncertain how to feel about the sudden complication to their family's social ambitions. Priscilla, however, wore an expression of calculating interest that suggested her mind had already begun working through the implications of what she had just witnessed. "The seamstress's daughter," Priscilla murmured to her sister, careful to keep her voice low enough that Julian and his mother, still several paces away, could not overhear. "The Duke of Quorn has been courting the seamstress's daughter, in secret, disguised as a common traveler. This changes everything, Camille." "Changes what, exactly?" Camille asked, uncertain of her sister's meaning. "Our approach," Priscilla said, her eyes narrowing with calculated thought. "If the Duke has developed feelings for this girl, based on a false identity, those feelings may prove fragile once properly tested. A woman of her station, suddenly thrust into contact with the true weight of noble society, may find herself entirely unprepared for the scrutiny and expectation that comes with such attention. We simply need to ensure that scrutiny arrives, and arrives harshly." Camille frowned slightly, uncertain about the direction her sister's thoughts were taking, though years of following Priscilla's lead in most matters kept her from voicing outright objection. "Nothing dramatic," Priscilla said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "Merely ensure that certain facts about the Duke's unusual courtship reach the right ears, in the right social circles, at precisely the right moment, to cause the maximum discomfort for our unexpected rival." Unaware of the calculating scheme already forming behind them, Julian returned to the estate that evening in a state of quiet turmoil, his mind consumed by the memory of Alara's stricken expression, the hurt so clearly visible in her eyes, before she had turned and walked away. He spent the following days attempting to arrange another meeting, sending careful notes through discreet intermediaries, but each attempt was met with polite but firm refusal. Margaret, Alara's mother, had been horrified to learn the truth of Julian's identity, though her horror was tempered by genuine concern for her daughter's obvious heartbreak, rather than any particular anger toward the Duke himself. "He is the Duke of Quorn," Margaret said one evening, sitting beside her daughter, as Alara stared blankly at unfinished mending in her lap, unable to focus on the careful stitches that usually came so naturally to her. "The very Duke whose estate has stood at the heart of this county for generations, and he was walking through our village, disguised as an ordinary traveler, speaking with you, sharing meals with you, for weeks. I feel foolish," Alara admitted quietly. "I should have questioned his evasiveness more carefully. I should have recognized something was amiss." "You trusted someone who presented himself honestly, in every way, except his name and station," Margaret said gently. "That is not foolishness, my love. That is simply the natural result of genuine kindness meeting genuine deception, however well-intentioned that deception may have been." "Do you believe his intentions were genuine?" Alara asked, finally looking up at her mother with an expression caught between hope and fear of that very hope. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe," she said slowly, "that a man in his position, with his wealth and standing, had no practical need to invent an elaborate disguise, merely to entertain himself with a poor seamstress's daughter. If his intentions were purely selfish or cruel, there were far simpler ways to satisfy such desires without the trouble he apparently went through to protect your dignity, and his own vulnerability, throughout your acquaintance." Alara said nothing, though her mother's words settled uneasily in her mind, warring against the raw hurt of feeling deceived by someone she had trusted so completely. Meanwhile, word of the Duke's unusual courtship had indeed begun spreading, exactly as Priscilla Ashworth had intended, through careful, calculated whispers passed between servants and minor gentry throughout the county. By the time the rumors reached the more prominent noble families who regularly attended events at neighboring estates, the story had grown considerably beyond its original truth, twisted through repeated retelling into something far more scandalous than the actual circumstances warranted. Some versions claimed the Duke had secretly fathered a child with the seamstress's daughter. Others suggested the girl had somehow trapped him through manipulation, exploiting his kindness for financial gain. Still others painted Julian himself as a man of questionable judgment, unfit for the responsibilities of his title, if he could be so easily distracted by a common village girl. Julian learned of these rumors through Edmund, who reported them with visible reluctance, aware of how deeply they would trouble his employer. "This cannot continue," Julian said grimly, pacing his study with barely contained frustration. "These rumors will reach Alara eventually, if they have not already, and they will only deepen the hurt she already carries because of my own poor handling of this entire situation." "What do you intend to do, Your Grace?" Edmund asked carefully. Julian stopped pacing, his expression settling into something resolute, despite the obvious weight of worry still evident in his features. "I intend to make my intentions absolutely clear," he said. "Not through whispered rumors or careful intermediaries, but through public, undeniable action. I will not allow calculated gossip to define what exists between Alara and myself, nor will I allow her to bear the burden of scandal that rightfully belongs to my own poor judgment in handling this matter." "And how do you propose to accomplish this?" Edmund asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the ambitious scope of whatever plan his employer was beginning to formulate. "I will need time to prepare properly," Julian said, his mind already working through possibilities. "But first, I must speak with Alara again, properly this time, without interruption, without the shock of sudden revelation, clouding her ability to hear what I truly wish to say." That evening, Julian rode to the village alone, dismissing his usual escort, determined to reach Alara without the formal trappings of his position, creating additional distance between them. He arrived at the modest cottage as dusk settled over the surrounding fields, and found Margaret answering his knock with an expression of careful, guarded assessment. "Your Grace," she said, the title feeling strange and formal on her tongue, given the circumstances of his previous visits to their home, though she had never actually invited him inside before this moment. "Mistress Winters," Julian said, inclining his head with genuine respect, "I know I have no right to ask this, given how poorly I have handled the truth of my identity, but I beg a few moments to speak with your daughter, not as the Duke of Quorn, but simply as Julian, if she will permit it." Margaret studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity against her natural protective instincts as a mother. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him entrance, though her expression made clear that any further deception or careless handling of her daughter's feelings would not be tolerated. Elara looked up from her mending as Julian entered the small, humble sitting room, her expression shifting rapidly through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been cautious hope, though she quickly schooled her features into careful neutrality. "I did not expect you to come here," she said quietly. "I know I have no right to intrude upon your home," Julian said, remaining near the doorway, careful not to crowd her, despite his evident desire to close the distance between them. "But I could not allow the rumors currently spreading through the county to define what exists between us, without at least attempting to explain myself properly, without interruption this time." "What rumors?" Elara asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Julian hesitated, reluctant to burden her further, but recognizing that continued secrecy had already caused enough damage between them. "There are those who have twisted the truth of our acquaintance into something ugly and false," he said carefully. "I will not repeat the specific claims, as they deserve no credibility whatsoever, but I wanted you to hear the truth from me directly, rather than through whispered gossip designed to wound rather than inform." Elara set down her mending, giving him her full attention despite the lingering hurt still visible in her eyes. "Then tell me the truth," she said. "All of it, this time, without omission." And so, for the better part of an hour, Julian explained everything. His weariness with the calculated performances of noble society, his decision to walk the villages incognito simply to understand his own people more honestly, the moment he had witnessed her humiliation in the market square, and felt something shift within him that he could not fully explain even to himself. He spoke of his growing feelings, developed gradually, through honest conversation rather than any calculated scheme, and his genuine fear that revealing his title too soon would poison the authentic connection they had built. "I should have told you sooner," he admitted finally. "I recognize that now. My silence, however well-intentioned, caused you pain that you did not deserve, and for that, I am truly sorry." Elara listened carefully, her expression softening slightly as his words settled the churning uncertainty that had plagued her since the revelation in the market square. But softening was not the same as forgiveness, and she remained cautious, unwilling to surrender her guarded heart so easily after the shock she had recently endured. "I need time," she said finally. "Your explanation helps me understand your reasoning, but understanding does not erase the hurt of feeling deceived, nor does it address the very real complications your title creates for whatever exists between us. You are a duke, Julian. I am a seamstress's daughter. The world does not easily accommodate such a difference in station, regardless of genuine feeling." "I know," Julian said quietly, "but I intend to prove, through actions rather than mere words, that my feelings for you are genuine, and that I am prepared to face whatever difficulties our difference in station might create." Elara did not respond immediately, though something in her expression suggested his words had found purchase, despite her careful guardedness. As Julian finally took his leave that evening, riding back toward the distant lights of the Quorn estate, neither of them could have known how quickly circumstances would force the true test of his resolve, nor how far Priscilla Ashworth's calculated schemes had already progressed toward creating a public confrontation neither of them yet anticipated. 2 weeks after Julian's visit to the modest cottage, an invitation arrived at the Ashworth household that sent Priscilla into a flurry of triumphant activity. The Dowager Duchess Constance had announced a grand ball at the Quorn estate, ostensibly to celebrate the successful conclusion of the tenant dispute that had been resolved weeks earlier, though everyone in the county understood the true purpose ran deeper than mere celebration. "This is our opportunity," Priscilla told Camille excitedly, examining the elegant invitation with calculating eyes. "Every prominent family in the county will attend. If the Duke's attachment to that seamstress girl has genuinely weakened under the pressure of recent rumors, this ball will provide the perfect setting to secure his attention properly, where it belongs." And if it has not weakened, Camille asked cautiously. Then we shall simply need to ensure the rumors gain additional strength, Priscilla said, her smile carrying none of its usual warmth. A public setting provides ample opportunity for pointed questions and carefully placed observations that might remind the Duke and everyone else in attendance exactly how unsuitable such a match would prove for a man of his position. Word of the grand ball reached Alara through Mistress Colby, who had received a commission to prepare several gowns for wealthier families planning to attend, though naturally no such invitation extended to Alara or her mother, whose social standing remained far too modest for such elevated gatherings. I have heard the entire county will be there, Mistress Colby mentioned casually while reviewing measurements with Alara one afternoon, including, I am told, several families hoping to catch the Duke's particular attention. Quite the spectacle it shall be, I imagine. Alara said nothing, though something tightened uncomfortably in her chest at the thought of Julian surrounded by elegant noblewomen, each one presenting a far more suitable match than a poor seamstress's daughter could ever hope to be. She had not seen Julian since his visit to their cottage, though he had sent occasional notes, careful and respectful, asking after her well-being without pressing for more than she was prepared to give. She had not yet decided how to answer the question that continued to haunt her thoughts. Did she trust his explanation? Did she believe his feelings were genuine, despite the impossible gulf that separated their respective stations in life? And even if she did believe him, what future could realistically exist between a duke and a seamstress's daughter, regardless of whatever affection might have grown between them? These questions remained unresolved when, 3 days before the scheduled ball, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Winters cottage. It was not Julian, but rather Edmund, the steward Alara had encountered briefly on the wooden bridge weeks before, arriving with a formal air that immediately put Margaret on edge. Mistress Winters, Miss Winters, Edmund said, inclining his head respectfully to both women. I come on behalf of the Dowager Duchess Constance, who requests the pleasure of Miss Winters's company for a private conversation at the estate, at her earliest convenience. Margaret's eyebrows rose with surprise, and Alara felt her stomach tighten with sudden anxiety. The Duchess wishes to speak with me, she asked, uncertain what such a summons might mean. Indeed, Edmund confirmed. Her Grace was quite specific in her request, and I believe the matter concerns recent events of some sensitivity. Alara exchanged a worried glance with her mother, before agreeing to accompany Edmund to the estate the following morning, her curiosity and apprehension warring equally within her chest. The Quorn estate proved even grander than the stories Alara had heard throughout her childhood, its vast gardens stretching in every direction, its towering stone walls suggesting centuries of accumulated wealth and history. She felt acutely aware of her modest clothing as Edmund led her through the grand entrance hall, past servants who regarded her with poorly disguised curiosity, clearly having heard some version of the rumors already circulating through the county. The Dowager Duchess Constance received her in a smaller, more intimate sitting room, dismissing the attending servants with a simple gesture before turning her full attention to her unexpected guest. Thank you for coming, Miss Winters, Constance said, gesturing for Alara to sit in the chair across from her own. I imagine this summons has caused you considerable anxiety, and for that I apologize. I simply felt it important that we speak directly, rather than allowing rumors and speculation to continue defining a situation that concerns you, as much as it concerns my son. I appreciate your directness, Your Grace, Alara said carefully, settling into the offered chair despite her obvious discomfort in such unfamiliar and elevated surroundings. My son cares for you a great deal, Constance said, studying Alara with sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. More, I believe, than he has cared for anyone in quite some time. I wish to understand, for my own satisfaction, whether that affection is genuinely returned, or whether recent events have damaged any possibility of a future between you beyond repair. Alara considered her answer carefully, aware of the significant weight this conversation carried, not merely for her own future, but potentially for Julian's as well. I do not know how to answer that question honestly, Your Grace, she said finally. I care for Julian, the man I came to know before learning his true identity. But I do not know how such feelings can reasonably translate into any practical future, given the enormous difference in our respective stations. Practicality has rarely determined the course of genuine affection, Constance said, a note of something almost wistful entering her otherwise composed voice. I married for practical reasons myself, many years ago, and while my marriage proved respectful and reasonably content, I have often wondered what might have been possible had different circumstances allowed for a match built on genuine feeling rather than calculated advantage. Elara studied the Duchess carefully, surprised by this unexpected vulnerability from a woman she had assumed would prove far more guarded and formal. "You do not object to your son's interest in someone of my station?" she asked. "I object to deception," Constance said plainly. "I have made my feelings on that matter quite clear to Julian already. But I do not object to genuine affection, regardless of the social distance it must overcome. My son's title carries responsibility, certainly, but it does not require him to sacrifice happiness merely to satisfy the calculated ambitions of families like the Ashworths, who value connection to our name far more than any genuine regard for Julian himself." Elara felt something ease slightly in her chest at these words, though the practical concerns remained unresolved regardless of the Duchess's evident support. "Even with your understanding, Your Grace, the county will not easily accept such a match. The whispers and rumors already circulating make that abundantly clear. The county's opinion matters considerably less than you might imagine," Constance said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "Whispers fade when confronted with confident public truth. If Julian intends to pursue this connection seriously, he must do so openly, without further concealment, allowing his actions to speak more loudly than any calculated gossip designed to undermine you both." Before Elara could respond further, the sitting room door opened, and Julian himself entered, clearly having been informed of his mother's unexpected summons. He stopped short at the sight of Elara seated across from his mother, surprise evident across his features. "Mother," he said carefully, "I was not aware you intended to arrange this meeting. Someone needed to ensure this matter progressed with appropriate honesty," Constance said, rising from her chair with evident satisfaction at having accomplished whatever purpose she had intended through this private conversation. "I believe I have said what needed saying. The remainder of this conversation, I imagine, belongs properly to the two of you." She departed the room with quiet grace, leaving Julian and Elara alone together for the first time since his visit to the cottage weeks before. "I did not expect to see you here," Julian said, moving closer, though maintaining a respectful distance, given the uncertainty still lingering between them. "Your mother wished to understand my feelings," Elara said. "I believe she has grown genuinely invested in this situation, regardless of the complications it presents." "And what did you tell her?" Julian asked carefully. Elara hesitated, aware that whatever she said next would carry significant weight for whatever future might exist between them. "I told her the truth," she said finally, "that I care for you, despite everything, though I remain uncertain how such feelings can reasonably navigate the enormous distance between our respective positions in life." "There is a ball in 3 days," Julian said, his voice carrying a note of determination Elara had not heard from him before. "I intend to make my feelings for you known publicly, before the entire county, regardless of whatever scandal or resistance that revelation might provoke. I am tired of allowing calculated schemes and whispered gossip to define what exists between us. I would rather face that difficulty directly, with you beside me, than continue hiding behind careful discretion that only invites further speculation and pain." Elara's heart raced at the boldness of his proposal, fear and hope warring equally within her chest. "Julian, that could damage your standing considerably. The Ashworth sisters and others like them will not simply accept such a public declaration without significant resistance." "Let them resist," Julian said firmly. "I have spent my entire adult life allowing calculated social expectation to dictate my choices. I am done permitting that same calculation to determine who I choose to care for, and who I choose to build a future alongside, regardless of the station they were born into." Elara studied his determined expression for a long moment, weighing the enormous risk of what he proposed against the quiet, persistent hope that had refused to fully extinguish itself, despite everything that had happened between them. "If you are certain," she said finally, "then I will stand beside you, whatever consequences that ball might bring." Julian's expression softened with visible relief and gratitude, and for the first time since the painful revelation in the market square, something resembling their earlier easy warmth returned between them. tempered now by the weight of the significant challenge still awaiting them both, in just 3 days' time. Neither of them yet knew exactly how far Priscilla Ashworth's calculated schemes had progressed, nor how dramatically the coming ball would test the genuine strength of the connection they had built, piece by careful piece, since that first fateful encounter in the crowded market square. The 3 days leading up to the grand ball passed in a whirlwind of preparation and nervous anticipation for everyone involved, though each person's preparations carried entirely different purposes and expectations. At the Quorn estate, Julian met privately with his mother and Edmund to discuss exactly how he intended to handle the public declaration he had promised Alara. Constance, though supportive of her son's genuine feelings, remained practical about the challenges ahead. "You must consider the timing carefully," she advised, as they sat together, reviewing the guest list for the upcoming event. "A declaration made too early in the evening may seem hasty or ill-considered. Too late, and it may appear as though you lack the courage of your convictions until forced into action by circumstance." "I have considered the timing extensively," Julian said. "I intend to make my intentions clear during the evening's formal address, when I will already be expected to speak before the assembled guests regarding the estate's recent affairs. It provides a natural opportunity to introduce a matter of personal significance as well." Edmund cleared his throat carefully. "Your Grace, might I suggest additional precautions, given the rumors already circulating, particularly those originating from certain parties, with clear motivation to undermine this match? It would be wise to prepare a response to whatever objections or public challenges might arise during the evening." "What sort of challenges do you anticipate?" Julian asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "The Ashworth family has invested considerable effort in positioning Miss Priscilla as a favorable match for you." "Your Grace," Edmund said carefully. "I would not be surprised if they attempt some manner of public confrontation, hoping to embarrass Miss Winters before the assembled guests, and thereby discourage your continued interest through calculated humiliation." Julian's jaw tightened at this suggestion, memories of the market square mockery still fresh enough to provoke genuine anger at the thought of similar cruelty being directed at Alara again, this time in a setting far more consequential than a village marketplace. "Then we shall simply need to ensure such attempts fail," Julian said firmly. "Alara has endured enough public humiliation throughout her life, without further contribution from calculated schemers seeking personal advantage." Meanwhile, at the Winters cottage, preparations of a very different nature were underway. Margaret had insisted on creating a proper gown for her daughter to wear to the ball, despite Alara's initial protests that such expense was unnecessary and impractical given their limited resources. "You will not attend the grandest event this county has witnessed in years wearing an ordinary dress," Margaret said firmly, already sketching design ideas on scraps of paper scattered across their small kitchen table. "I have saved fabric for years, waiting for an occasion worthy of using it properly. This qualifies." Alara watched her mother's determined preparations with a mixture of gratitude and lingering anxiety about the evening ahead. "Mother, even with the finest gown imaginable, I will still be a seamstress's daughter standing among nobility, who have spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this sort of gathering. No amount of fine fabric will erase that difference." "No amount of fine fabric needs to erase anything," Margaret said, meeting her daughter's eyes with quiet conviction. "You possess something far more valuable than mere breeding or wealth, Alara. You possess genuine character, hard-won through years of difficulty that many of those noble guests have never had to face. That quality cannot be purchased or inherited, and it will serve you far better than any elaborate gown, regardless of how nervous you feel walking into that grand hall." Alara found herself unexpectedly moved by her mother's words, and over the following days, as Margaret worked tirelessly to complete a gown of deep blue fabric that brought out the color of Alara's eyes, something resembling genuine confidence began building alongside her lingering nervousness. Across the county, the Ashworth household buzzed with equally intense preparation, though driven by entirely different motivations. Priscilla had spent considerable time and effort ensuring that certain influential guests would be positioned strategically throughout the evening, ready to voice pointed questions or observations should the opportunity arise, to publicly challenge whatever connection existed between the Duke and the seamstress's daughter. "Everything is arranged," Priscilla told her sister, the evening before the ball, satisfaction evident in her carefully composed expression. Lord Gerald Whitmore has agreed to raise pointed questions regarding the Duke's recent unusual behavior, should the opportunity present itself during the formal proceedings. Several other guests have likewise been primed to express appropriate concern regarding matters of proper social conduct and suitable matches. "You seem quite confident this will succeed," Camille observed, still somewhat uneasy about the calculated cruelty her sister's schemes required. "I am simply ensuring that truth, properly presented, receives appropriate attention," Priscilla said, though the calculating gleam in her eyes suggested her definition of truth carried considerably more malice than genuine concern for propriety. "The Duke of Quorn deserves a match worthy of his station, not some passing infatuation with a common village girl who happened to catch his eye through unconventional circumstances." The evening of the ball arrived with clear skies and a gentle warmth that seemed to promise good fortune, though the tension building within several key participants suggested the evening ahead would prove far more complicated than simple weather patterns might predict. Ilara arrived at the Quorn estate in the deep blue gown her mother had labored over for 3 days, feeling simultaneously beautiful and utterly out of place as she stepped from the modest carriage Julian had arranged for her transportation. The grand entrance hall, filled with elegantly dressed guests and glittering chandeliers, seemed to swallow her whole, and she felt every curious and judgmental glance directed her way as word spread quickly through the assembled crowd regarding her unexpected presence. "There she is," she heard Priscilla whisper to a nearby companion, loud enough to ensure Ilara caught the words clearly. "The seamstress's daughter, dressed up for an evening she has no business attending." Ilara kept her chin high, remembering her mother's words about the value of character over breeding, though her heart still raced uncomfortably as she made her way through the crowded hall, searching for a familiar face among the sea of unfamiliar, judgmental strangers. She found Julian near the grand staircase, dressed in formal attire that seemed to transform him into someone almost unrecognizable from the plainly dressed traveler she had first encountered in the village market square. His expression brightened immediately upon seeing her, relief and admiration evident in equal measure. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, offering his arm as she approached. "Thank you for coming, despite everything this evening might bring." "I gave you my word," Ilara said, though her voice trembled slightly, with nervousness she could not fully suppress. "Though I confess, I have never felt quite so out of place in my entire life." "You belong here as much as anyone in this hall," Julian said firmly. "More perhaps, given the genuine character you have demonstrated throughout everything that has happened between us these past months." They moved together through the crowd, Julian introducing Ilara to several guests who greeted her with varying degrees of polite curiosity or barely concealed disdain. The formal proceedings of the evening progressed as expected, with music, dancing, and elaborate refreshments occupying the guests' attention through the early hours of the celebration. But as the evening wore toward its later hours, and the formal address Julian had promised to deliver approached, tension began building visibly among certain key participants, none more so than Priscilla Ashworth, who watched the growing warmth between Julian and Ilara with increasingly poorly concealed frustration. Finally, as the orchestra paused between dances and servants moved through the crowd distributing final refreshments, Julian moved toward the grand staircase, preparing to deliver the address the assembled guests had been anticipating throughout the evening, an address that would prove far more consequential than anyone beyond his closest circle yet realized. Ilara watched him ascend the stairs, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear in equal measure, aware that whatever happened in the next few moments would likely determine not only her own future, but potentially reshape the entire social landscape of the county itself. Beside her, though she did not notice at first, Priscilla Ashworth had begun moving purposefully through the crowd, positioning herself and several carefully primed allies at strategic points throughout the grand hall, preparing to unleash whatever calculated confrontation she had spent the preceding days arranging, timed precisely to disrupt whatever declaration Julian intended to make before the assembled guests. Julian reached the top of the grand staircase, and the assembled orchestra fell silent at a discreet signal from Edmund, who stood near the musicians, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had organized countless formal events throughout his years of service to the estate. The gathered guests turned their attention toward the staircase, anticipating the customary remarks expected from their host regarding the successful resolution of recent estate matters. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," Julian began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed grand hall. This gathering was arranged to celebrate the peaceful resolution of a dispute that threatened the livelihood of several tenant families under this estate's protection. That matter has been resolved satisfactorily, and I am grateful to everyone who assisted in reaching that resolution. Polite applause rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, it seemed the evening might proceed exactly as expected, with formal pleasantries exchanged before returning to dancing and refreshment. But Julian remained standing at the top of the staircase, his expression suggesting he had more to say. However, he continued, I find myself compelled to address another matter this evening, one of considerably more personal significance, though I believe it deserves equal honesty and public acknowledgement. Whispers began rippling through the crowd, curiosity mixing with the barely concealed anticipation of those who had already heard rumors regarding the Duke's unusual recent behavior. Several weeks ago, Julian continued, his eyes finding Alara's face among the crowd below, I met a young woman in a nearby village while traveling incognito, wishing to understand my tenants and neighbors without the distortions that inevitably accompany my title. That woman demonstrated more genuine character, dignity, and honesty than I have encountered in years spent among calculated society, and I found myself increasingly drawn to her company, regardless of the significant difference in our respective stations. The whispers grew louder, and Alara felt every eye in the grand hall gradually turning toward her as guests began putting together the pieces of Julian's careful address. I recognize, Julian continued, that certain rumors have circulated recently regarding this connection, rumors that have twisted an honest, if imperfectly handled courtship into something scandalous and cruel. I wish to address those rumors directly, before this entire assembly, rather than allowing calculated gossip to continue defining a matter that concerns my own happiness, and the happiness of someone whose dignity has already been tested unfairly enough throughout her life. It was at this precise moment that Priscilla Ashworth, having positioned herself strategically near the base of the staircase, stepped forward with calculated timing, her voice carrying clearly enough to interrupt Julian's carefully prepared address. Your Grace, she called out, her tone carrying deliberate concern beneath its surface politeness. Surely, you cannot mean to suggest that a seamstress's daughter, however charming her company might have proven during casual conversation, represents a suitable match for a man of your considerable standing and responsibility. Such a connection would surely invite considerable scandal and potentially damage the reputation this estate has worked centuries to establish. A murmur of agreement rippled through certain sections of the crowd, several guests clearly primed by Priscilla's earlier efforts to voice similar concerns should the opportunity arise. Julian's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his composure as he addressed Priscilla's challenge directly before the assembled guests. Miss Ashworth, he said, his voice carrying clear authority despite its measured tone. I recall quite vividly the day I first encountered Miss Winters in the village market square. She was enduring public mockery from two young women who found amusement in humiliating someone for the simple crime of possessing less wealth than themselves. I believe you were one of those young women, Miss Ashworth, if my memory serves correctly. Priscilla's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger as several nearby guests turned to regard her with sudden, uncomfortable understanding. That was merely harmless jest, Priscilla said quickly, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confident authority. Nothing more than the ordinary teasing that occurs between young people in any village setting. Cruelty dressed as jest remains cruelty regardless of the label applied to it, Julian said firmly. Miss Winters endured that humiliation with more grace and dignity than I have witnessed from most noble guests, attending elaborate balls throughout this entire county. That dignity, that genuine character, is precisely what drew my attention and admiration, far more than any calculated performance of noble breeding could ever accomplish. The grand hall had grown remarkably quiet, every guest now fully attentive to the unfolding confrontation, aware that something significant and unprecedented was unfolding before them. I recognize, Julian continued, turning his attention back to address the entire assembled crowd rather than Priscilla alone, that many of you may share similar concerns regarding the suitability of such a match. I understand the weight of tradition and expectation that accompanies my position. But I have spent my entire adult life allowing calculated social expectation to dictate my choices in matters both significant and trivial. I am no longer willing to sacrifice genuine happiness, merely to satisfy expectations built more on ambition and calculated advantage than on any authentic concern for my own well-being or that of this estate's future. He descended the staircase slowly, deliberately, making his way through the parting crowd until he stood directly before Alara, who had remained frozen throughout the entire confrontation, scarcely able to believe the scene unfolding before her. "Alara Winters," Julian said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear clearly, "I would be honored if you would allow me to court you properly, publicly, before this entire assembly, and the greater county beyond it, without further concealment or discretion, born of fear, regarding what others might think or say." Alara felt every eye in the grand hall fixed upon her, the weight of the moment nearly overwhelming, though something steadying in Julian's steady gray eyes gave her the courage to respond clearly, despite her racing heart. "I would be honored as well," she said, her voice carrying more strength than she had expected, given the enormity of the moment and the audience witnessing it. A ripple of reaction spread through the assembled guests, mixed between genuine approval, curious speculation, and, from certain quarters, including the visibly furious Ashworth sisters, poorly concealed disapproval. But the majority of the reaction, Alara noticed with cautious surprise, leaned toward genuine warmth and approval, rather than the harsh judgment she had feared throughout the entire evening. "This is preposterous," Priscilla said, her composure finally breaking entirely under the weight of her failed scheme. "The entire county will become a laughingstock, allowing a duke to court a common seamstress's daughter, as though station and breeding mean nothing at all." "Station and breeding," Constance said, stepping forward from where she had been observing the entire scene with quiet satisfaction, "have never guaranteed genuine character, Miss Ashworth, as your own conduct this evening has demonstrated rather clearly. My son has chosen a woman of genuine substance and dignity, qualities I find considerably more valuable than mere inherited position. I suggest you consider carefully whether your own conduct this evening reflects the values you claim to champion so vigorously." Priscilla, faced with the combined public disapproval of the Duke, the Dowager Duchess, and increasingly the majority of guests who had witnessed her calculated cruelty exposed so plainly before them, found herself with no adequate response, and quickly retreated from the confrontation, her carefully constructed schemes lying in ruins around her. The orchestra, at a subtle signal from Edmund, resumed playing a gentle waltz, and gradually, the tension in the grand hall began dissipating as guests returned to dancing and conversation, though the topic of the evening's unprecedented declaration would undoubtedly dominate discussion throughout the county for weeks to come. Julian offered his hand to Alara, and together they moved onto the dance floor, the weight of public scrutiny still evident around them, but tempered now by a growing sense of genuine acceptance among the majority of guests who had witnessed the sincerity of Julian's declaration, and the quiet dignity with which Alara had responded to it. "Thank you," Alara whispered, as they moved together through the steps of the dance, "for choosing honesty tonight, regardless of the risk it carried." "I should have chosen honesty from the very beginning," Julian replied quietly, "but I am grateful for this opportunity to correct that mistake properly, before everyone who matters, without further concealment standing between us." As they continued dancing, neither of them noticed the quiet, calculating look that passed between Priscilla and a small group of her closest allies near the edge of the grand hall, a look that suggested this particular defeat, however public and humiliating, would not necessarily mark the end of her determined efforts to prevent this unlikely match from reaching its natural conclusion. In the weeks following the grand ball, news of Julian's public declaration spread rapidly throughout the county, carried by servants, merchants, and travelers who found the story too remarkable not to share with anyone willing to listen. As with most stories passed through many mouths, the details grew somewhat exaggerated with each retelling, though the core truth remained largely intact. The Duke of Quorn had publicly declared his intention to court a seamstress's daughter, defying the calculated schemes of ambitious families who had hoped to secure his attention for their own purposes. For Alara, the weeks that followed brought a strange mixture of continued challenge and unexpected joy. Certain noble families, particularly those closely allied with the Ashworth family's social ambitions, continued treating her with poorly disguised disdain, whenever their paths crossed at village gatherings or estate functions. But many others, surprised and genuinely moved by the sincerity Julian had demonstrated, began extending cautious warmth and acceptance that Alara had never expected to receive from noble society. Mistress Colby, delighted by the unexpected connection her favorite seamstress had formed with the Duke himself, began receiving even more commissions from families eager to associate themselves, however peripherally, with someone now connected to the Quorn estate. Margaret found herself overwhelmed with new work, though she approached each commission with the same careful, humble dedication that had always defined her craft, regardless of her daughter's changing circumstances. Julian, meanwhile, found himself navigating the complicated waters of formal courtship with an earnestness that surprised even those who knew him well. He visited the Winters cottage regularly, no longer disguised as a simple traveler, but arriving openly as himself, treating Margaret with genuine respect and warmth that quickly won over any lingering reservations she harbored regarding his suitability for her daughter. "You have changed him," Constance observed to Alara, during one of the increasingly frequent visits Alara made to the Quorn estate, as the two women had developed an unexpected friendship over shared tea and quiet conversation. "He smiles more freely than I have seen since his father's passing, left him burdened with responsibilities far beyond his years." "I believe he has changed himself," Alara replied thoughtfully. "I merely provided an opportunity for him to remember what genuine happiness feels like, separate from the calculated performances he had grown accustomed to throughout noble society." "Perhaps," Constance said with a knowing smile, "though I suspect you undervalue your own contribution to that transformation considerably." Not everyone in the county, however, had accepted the unlikely match with such grace. Priscilla Ashworth, though publicly humiliated at the grand ball, had not entirely abandoned her determination to prevent Alara from securing a permanent place within noble society. Rather than continuing her efforts through open confrontation, which had proven so disastrously unsuccessful, she shifted her tactics toward quieter, more calculated schemes, designed to test Alara's resolve and create doubt regarding her suitability for such an elevated position. Invitations to certain gatherings mysteriously failed to reach Alara, despite Julian's clear instructions that she should be included in every relevant social occasion. Whispered comments, carefully timed to reach Alara's ears through servants or minor acquaintances, continued suggesting she would never truly belong among noble society, regardless of Julian's genuine affection for her. Alara endured these continued challenges with the same quiet dignity that had first captured Julian's attention in the village market square, though the constant undercurrent of resistance occasionally tested her resolve more than she cared to admit, even to herself. "Does it bother you?" Julian asked one afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's extensive gardens, "the continued resistance from certain quarters of noble society? I recognize that despite my public declaration, many still question whether you truly belong within this world." "It bothers me," Alara admitted honestly, "though perhaps less than you might expect. I have endured public judgment my entire life, Julian, for the simple crime of possessing less wealth than others around me. This resistance, however uncomfortable, differs little from challenges I have faced throughout my entire existence. The difference now is that I face it with genuine support beside me, rather than facing it entirely alone, as I once did." "You should not have to endure any of it," Julian said, frustration evident in his voice. "Not now. Not with my public support standing clearly behind you." "Perhaps not," Alara agreed, "but endurance has always been part of my character, long before you entered my life. I do not intend to abandon that resilience now, regardless of how uncomfortable certain challenges might prove." Julian studied her with evident admiration, the same quality that had first drawn his attention months before, continuing to deepen his affection with each passing week. "I admire your strength considerably," he said quietly, "though I hope you will allow me to shoulder some portion of these burdens alongside you, rather than facing every challenge entirely through your own resilience." "I would welcome that," Alara said, offering a genuine smile that had grown increasingly frequent throughout their recent weeks together. "Though I suspect certain challenges will require patience beyond even your considerable resources, Julian. Priscilla Ashworth does not strike me as a woman who abandons her ambitions easily, regardless of public setbacks." Julian's expression grew serious at this observation. "I have heard rumors that she continues certain calculated efforts to undermine your standing, Despite the clear outcome of our public declaration, I intend to address this matter directly, before it causes further difficulty for either of us." True to his word, Julian arranged a private meeting with Priscilla's father, a respected, though modestly positioned member of local gentry who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his daughter's continued schemes, particularly given the public embarrassment already suffered at the grand ball. "Your Grace," Mr. Ashworth said nervously, as they met in a private study at the Quorn estate, "I assure you, my daughter's continued behavior does not reflect the values our family truly wishes to represent. I have spoken with her extensively regarding the impropriety of her recent conduct." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Ashworth," Julian said carefully, "though I confess I am more interested in concrete resolution than mere assurances. Miss Winters has already endured considerable difficulty throughout her life, due to circumstances entirely beyond her control. I will not tolerate continued calculated efforts to undermine her standing, simply because certain parties resent the outcome of legitimate courtship, freely chosen between two consenting adults." Mr. Ashworth, recognizing both the genuine authority behind Julian's words and the practical wisdom of maintaining good relations with the estate that held considerable influence throughout the county, promised to address his daughter's continued behavior more forcefully, a promise that, over the following weeks, proved largely effective in reducing, though not entirely eliminating, the quieter schemes Priscilla had continued pursuing. Gradually, as months passed, and Julian's genuine devotion to Alara remained evident through countless small gestures and continued public support, even the most reluctant members of noble society began accepting the reality of their unlikely match. Recognizing that whatever difference in station existed between them, the genuine affection and mutual respect they demonstrated toward each other exceeded anything typically witnessed in more conventional noble courtships built primarily on calculated advantage rather than authentic feeling. Alara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, growing increasingly comfortable within the elevated circles she now regularly moved through, though she never abandoned the humble character and genuine warmth that had first captured Julian's attention in that fateful village market square. She continued assisting her mother with sewing commissions whenever time allowed, refusing to abandon entirely the modest life that had shaped her character so significantly, even as her circumstances continued evolving toward something far grander than she had ever imagined possible. As autumn gave way to winter, and the courtship between Julian and Alara continued deepening through countless shared moments of genuine connection, both of them understood that the most significant test of their relationship still lay ahead, the formal proposal that would, if accepted, permanently and irrevocably bind their two very different worlds together before the entire county, and likely beyond it, in a union that would challenge long-established traditions regarding station, breeding, and worthiness in ways the county had rarely witnessed throughout its considerable history. Winter settled over the Quorn estate with a quiet beauty that transformed the extensive gardens into something almost otherworldly, frost tracing delicate patterns across every branch and hedge, the grand stone walls of the estate standing solemn and dignified beneath pale winter skies. It was during this season, nearly a year after their first encounter in the crowded village market square, that Julian made a decision he had been carefully considering for several months. He met privately with his mother one evening, seeking her counsel on a matter he considered too significant to approach without proper consideration. "I intend to ask Alara to marry me," he said simply, watching his mother's expression carefully for her reaction. Constance smiled warmly, though her eyes carried a thoughtful seriousness that suggested she understood the full weight of what her son proposed. "I suspected this conversation was coming," she said. "Are you certain of this decision, Julian? Marriage carries permanence that mere courtship does not require. Once bound formally, the challenges you have already faced regarding her station will only intensify, given the additional weight and permanence that marriage carries within noble society." "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life," Julian said firmly. "Alara possesses more genuine character, wisdom, and strength than any woman I have encountered throughout years of calculated noble courtship. I do not wish to spend my life alongside someone chosen merely for practical advantage or social convenience. I wish to spend it alongside someone I genuinely respect and love, regardless of whatever additional challenges that choice might invite." Constance studied her son for a long moment before nodding slowly, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Then you have my full blessing," she said, "though I suspect you already knew that before asking my opinion at all." "Your blessing means considerably more to me than mere formality, Mother," Julian said sincerely. "Alara has grown quite fond of you these past months. Your acceptance of her has meant a great deal, particularly given the resistance she has faced from certain other quarters. She has earned that acceptance through her own genuine character," Constance said. "I merely recognized what was already evident to anyone willing to look past superficial considerations of station and breeding." With his mother's blessing secured, Julian turned his attention toward planning the proposal itself, wanting to create a moment that honored both the significance of the commitment he intended to make and the genuine simplicity that had characterized their entire relationship from its very beginning in that humble market square encounter. He settled, eventually, on a modest approach that felt more authentic to their relationship than any grand, elaborate gesture might have accomplished. He would propose not within the grand halls of the Quorn estate, but at the very bench near the village market square where they had shared honey bread during one of their earliest conversations, a location that held far more genuine sentimental value than any elaborate estate setting could ever provide. He arranged the visit carefully, ensuring Alara would join him there, under the pretense of an ordinary afternoon walk, wanting the proposal itself to arrive as a genuine surprise, rather than an elaborately staged formal event. The afternoon he had chosen arrived crisp and clear, winter sunlight filtering through bare branches as Julian and Alara walked together through the quiet village streets, following a route that gradually led them toward the familiar covered bench where their relationship had first begun deepening beyond simple acquaintance. "This feels familiar," Alara observed with a small smile, recognizing their destination as they approached. "I thought you might appreciate returning to where everything truly began," Julian said, guiding her toward the bench with visible nervousness that Alara found rather endearing, given how rarely she witnessed him appearing anything less than perfectly composed. They sat together on the familiar bench, and for a moment, Julian said nothing, simply gathering his thoughts, before finally turning to face her directly. "Alara," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that immediately captured her full attention. "A year ago, in that very market square, I witnessed something in you that I had never encountered throughout my entire life, spent among calculated noble society. I witnessed genuine dignity, genuine strength, and genuine character, demonstrated not through elaborate performance, but through quiet, authentic endurance of circumstances that would have broken many others entirely." Alara felt her heart racing, sensing the significance of whatever Julian intended to say next, though she remained quiet, allowing him to continue at his own careful pace. "Since that day," he continued, "you have consistently demonstrated that same genuine character, through every challenge, every obstacle, every calculated attempt by others to convince you that you do not belong within circles you have every right to occupy, through your own merit and dignity, regardless of the circumstances of your birth. I have come to realize, over this past year, that I do not wish to spend my life alongside anyone else. I wish to spend it alongside you, building a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and authentic affection, rather than calculated advantage or empty social convenience." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it carefully to reveal a modest but beautifully crafted ring, its simple elegance reflecting the genuine sincerity of his proposal, rather than any calculated display of extravagant wealth. "Alara Winters," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible emotion evident in his expression. "Would you honor me by becoming my wife, and by extension, the future Duchess of Quorn, regardless of whatever challenges or resistance that position might continue to invite from those who value station over genuine character?" Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelming emotion finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained throughout the difficult year of public scrutiny and continued resistance from certain quarters of noble society. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with genuine joy. "Yes, Julian, I would be honored beyond anything I ever imagined possible." Julian's expression broke into a genuine smile of pure relief and happiness as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a long moment, they simply sat together on that familiar bench, the same location where honey bread and quiet conversation had first planted the seeds of a connection that had grown, despite considerable obstacles, into something neither of them had ever expected to find. News of their engagement spread through the county with remarkable speed, and while certain quarters continued expressing reservations regarding the unconventional match, the majority of the county's response proved surprisingly warm, particularly given the genuine devotion Julian had consistently demonstrated throughout the past year, and the quiet dignity Alara had maintained despite considerable challenges to her worthiness. Priscilla Ashworth, upon hearing the news, found herself finally accepting the futility of her continued resistance, recognizing that whatever calculated schemes she might still attempt would prove entirely powerless against a bond built on such genuine, tested foundation. The wedding itself, held the following spring within the grand halls of the Quorn estate, drew guests from throughout the county and beyond, curious to witness the formal union between the Duke of Quorn and the seamstress's daughter, whose remarkable story had captured the imagination of the entire region. Margaret, dressed in a gown crafted by her own careful hands, watched with tears of genuine joy as her daughter, once mocked and humiliated in a crowded market square, walked down the aisle toward a future that honored every ounce of dignity and strength she had demonstrated throughout her difficult but ultimately triumphant journey. As Julian and Alara exchanged their formal vows before the assembled guests, both of them understood that their story represented something far more significant than a simple romantic tale between a nobleman and a common village girl. It represented a genuine triumph of authentic character over calculated social expectation, a testament to the truth that genuine dignity and strength could transcend even the most rigid boundaries of station and breeding, provided both parties possessed sufficient courage to defy convention in pursuit of authentic happiness. The girl once mockingly called a beggar's girl now stood as the Duchess of Quorn, not through mere fortune or calculated ambition, but through the simple, powerful truth of who she had always genuinely been, finally recognized and celebrated before the entire county that had once dismissed her so casually. And as Julian took her hand before all assembled witnesses, sealing their union with a promise of genuine partnership built on mutual respect rather than calculated convenience, both of them understood that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, exactly as they had faced every obstacle throughout their remarkable journey from that first fateful encounter in a crowded, unremarkable village market square.